One of the really interesting things about the NFL draft compared to other sports is that there is the question of should you draft for need? Because when it comes to hockey and baseball, the player you're drafting isn't going to be ready for a couple years anyway, usually with some exceptions like the first couple of picks in hockey. Basketball does kind of have this, but ultimately it's usually accepted that if you can get a great player in basketball, you try and get a great player in basketball. I believe. I'm not too into basketball, so correct me if I'm wrong there. But football, this is a huge part of the draft. It's not just going out and trying to add good players, but trying to add the right players because free agency happens before the draft does. It's possible you tried to find the right pieces in free agency, but you said, oh, we really need a left guard right now. And now entering the draft, that's your only chance to make sure you get that left guard. So the question I'm going to ask today and hopefully answer is it smart to draft for need? And immediately there is a great argument for drafting for a need and a great argument against drafting for need. The great argument for is because if you don't draft for need, you will have a hole on your team. And if you draft best player available and it's wide receiver and you're already great at wide receiver and now you have a bad guard, you have not successfully made your team that much better. Whereas if you draft for you draft a guard, you have now made your team better. The counter argument against that, which again, logically makes sense, is, well, now you are drafting a worse player, assuming that the receiver is better than guard. You're essentially trading down value just to fill a hole, and is that a smart idea? You're getting a worse player. And so that's kind of I think both sides of the coin here. And so I wanted to kind of figure out a way that I can go through this and look at some data. And one thing I had realized was last year I had done a kind of a fun exercise where I did mock drafts, and I did two different mock drafts. I did one where every single team drafted best player available regardless of need, and another one where every single team only drafted for need. They drafted best player available that fills a need. And it was an interesting thing to go back and look at. So for one thing, I mean, sometimes just the list was wrong, right? So for example, on the consensus big board, Drake May was over Jaden Daniels, so I had the Commanders get Drake May instead of Jaden Daniels. Daniels had a much better rookie year, so okay, that happened, but that's kind of irrelevant to the discussion that we're having. But looking at, for example, teams just getting best player available, far more often than not, I felt like it helped the team that just drafted the better player, at least when you're looking at them right now. So, for example, the New York Jets drafted a tackle who seems to be a pretty solid prospect. We'll see how he continues to grow. They drafted a tackle because that's what they needed. They wanted to make sure they could protect Aaron Rodgers, who, as we know now, is no longer there. The Jets season went horribly wrong. But had they drafted best player available, they would have had Brock Bowers, who was an all-pro as a rookie. Now, one exception to the drafting best player available thing just has to be the quarterback position. It matters so much. And so, for example, the Broncos ended up drafting Quinyon Mitchell, very good player, but obviously they're much happier with Bo Nix, right? Even if Mitchell was better on the prospect big board, Bo Nix is the quarterback. Quarterbacks matter more. And so that just has to be an exception that's built in when you're talking about drafting best player available is quarterbacks. If you have a quarterback, because that's another thing, I think the Cardinals drafted a quarterback. Obviously, they're better not doing that. So that's one thing you have to pay attention to. As for the downsides, it's actually trickier to decide if this is a negative or not. But like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in this version of the draft got Adonai Mitchell, who was a good wide receiver last year for the Colts. Instead, the Buccaneers in real life drafted Graham Barton, a center, which they desperately needed to improve their interior offensive line. Mitchell would have come in and played some meaningful snaps for Tampa Bay, and I don't know how he would have done in that system. Again, you had Chris Godwin get injured. Who knows? Maybe if they do this, they don't re-sign Chris Godwin and instead use that money to help the interior. Could have used that money to maybe get a better center. Who knows what happens there, right? That's, I think, completely up for debate. I think you could argue they're better off with what they did. You could argue they would have been better off drafting for need. It really comes down to personal preference there. Also, the Buffalo Bills in this exercise got Jackson Powers-Johnson, someone who they definitely did not need. But to be honest, I think they would probably rather have him than Keon Coleman, who they traded back with and got in real life. So there are things like that where sometimes drafting for best player available instead of for need, actually a year later, you're really happy you did it. As I said, I also did the other side. I said if every team only drafted for need, and you get some just like obvious, like ones that are going to be weird, right? Like the Jets drafted Tyler Nubin at pick 10 because safety was a big need for them, and there wasn't really a safety that was worth a top 10 pick. So you're going to get some of that, which would never happen in real life. Funny enough, in both of these, the Chargers ended up getting Malik Neighbors in both of these exercises, which is kind of funny. I don't really know what to make of that, but yeah, that's interesting. I think they're happy with Joe Alt, although I think they would have been happy with Malik Neighbors too. But there are ones that I definitely think did not work out. Like, for example, the Falcons got Leyu Latu with pick number 8, who, again, that's one that a lot of people were saying that should be what the Falcons are doing, getting a pass rusher. They were heavily mocked for getting Michael Penix Jr., but ultimately, I think they're happier with Michael Penix Jr. than they are with an edge rusher, even if you can critique some of the ways they got there with now having to pay the Kirk Cousins contract and all that. Still, I think that you would look at the Falcons and say them drafting best player available instead of for need was a success. But personally, my logic going into this was I assumed, okay, well, drafting for best player available is going to help you long-term usually, because usually in a couple years, there's going to be a hole in the roster somewhere. With the exception of only a couple positions, there's usually multiple players who play that position at a given time, right? Several receivers play, several guards play, several tackles play, several defensive linemen play, all that good stuff. But I figured short term, drafting for need would help. But what's interesting is I actually think the Philadelphia Eagles in that exercise were a perfect example of why even that might not necessarily be the case. So again, in real life, the Eagles drafted Quinyon Mitchell in the first round, which was still a need, which should be mentioned. But in the exercise, they drafted linebacker Edgerrin Cooper because that was considered a bigger need for the Philadelphia Eagles. What's really interesting is that because that was a bigger need at the time, it ended up actually being a strength of the Eagles. They had such a good off-ball linebacking group that when Nakobe Dean got injured, they were able to have Oren Burks come in, and he even played well as a backup. Of course, Zach Bond was an all-pro there. It just goes to show that sometimes something that feels like a need doesn't end up actually being a need, and something that feels like a position that you absolutely don't need to improve upon ends up being a position you absolutely need to improve upon. And so, because of that, I think that's kind of where my final conclusion lies, which is if you're making a slight difference on player, if you're in between two players and one fills a need, one doesn't, you should probably get the one that fills a need, right? There's enough extra value there to make it work. But ultimately, if you're taking a guy who is a tier lower just because they fill a need, you don't know where you're going to be in a couple years, and you're getting a worse player by doing it, which means in the long run, you make enough picks like that, ultimately it's going to cause more harm than good. There have been instances where, drafting for need works out, but usually in those instances, it's because you're also getting either the best player available or one of the better players available. Like, I think one of the all-time great examples of drafting for need was when Tampa Bay drafted Tristan Wirfs and Antoine Winfield because they went into that draft needing a tackle and a safety, but also they got an all-pro tackle and an all-pro safety, right? That it kind of is, obvious that, yes, if you can fill a need and get the best player available at both of those picks, then that's always going to work out. But I think Tampa Bay would love that draft even if they didn't really need a tackle or safety in that situation. And that is ultimately where I think this discussion lies. I think about the Philadelphia Eagles, who, while last year they did kind of fill a secondary need, in most of their drafts, they kind of have just drafted best player available. They didn't need an interior defensive lineman when they drafted Jalen Carter, right? But he was just the best player available, and now he's a star for them. I think that's usually the logic I would go with. If it's close, fill a need. If it's not close, get best player available. But yeah, that's what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from y'all. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.